This is the P-3C Orion aircraft. It's made by Lockheed Martin. They've been making them since the 1960s. It's got 4 turboprop engines, you can see there. This is a plane that can fly really, really far. It can stay in the air for a really, really long time. The Navy says the P-3 Orion has been its, quote, frontline land-based maritime patrol aircraft since the 1960s. They got a bunch of these, and they use them all over the world. They're about $36 million each. As I said, the military has a lot of them. But it's interesting. It's not just the U.S. military that has a lot of them. A bunch of other militaries around the world have them, too. This is one of these American military aircraft that we are very happy to sell to friendly governments all over the world. And that is what allowed this to happen in 2014. Look carefully at that picture. Yes, that is a roof punctured by the top tail fins of a bunch of airplanes. This is 2014 in Japan. They had a really big snowstorm, and there was this 60-year-old aircraft hangar at a maintenance facility that had 6 Japanese P-3 Orions in it and 4 P-3 Orions that belonged to the U.S. Navy. They had this giant snowstorm. It had a flat roof on that building. The roof could not deal with the weight of the snow. The roof collapsed, the hangar collapsed, and all the planes got squished, but not before their tail fins poked through the ceiling. So, yeah, that was a very expensive snowstorm crushing all those planes. That same kind of plane, a P-3C Orion, was on a patrol mission last Wednesday in the South China Sea when it had what the Navy is now calling an unsafe encounter with a Chinese military plane. Now, this is not one of those things where they send a little fighter jet out to go do barrel rolls around one of our surveillance aircraft or something. It's the P-3 Orion that was the U.S. plane involved here. But this was the Chinese plane. Look at that. This was the plane that was involved in this unsafe incident on the Chinese side, or at least it was a plane like this. This is a weird-looking plane, isn't it? It's also a 4-engine turboprop plane. It's sort of pot-bellied, sort of sway-bellied. It's got this sharp little, pug nose. And then it's got this big thing that sticks off the top that looks like a solar panel from the 70s before we knew how to put them on right. It's like the world's least aerodynamic radar array. But that was it. That was the plane involved. On Wednesday of last week, that weird-looking plane, or one just like it, according to the U.S. military, quote, crossed the nose of a U.S. Navy P-3 Orion. Pentagon says that the U.S. plane was in international airspace. Again, the Orion, they say, was just on a routine patrol in the South China Sea. And this lumbering, strange-looking Chinese plane with what looks like a big billboard on its back crossed right in front of the Navy Orion. It came within 1,000 feet of the U.S. Navy plane. According to the U.S. military, the American pilots in the Orion had to take a hard turn. They had to alter their course abruptly in order to avoid a mid-air collision. They came within 1,000 feet. And there are a couple of weird things about this. The first is these are not the kind of planes you expect to be involved in an incident like this, right? These are big, both of them, big, lumbering surveillance aircraft that have been flying for decades. They're both turboprops, right? I mean, the Orion, again, virtually unchanged since the 1960s. That Chinese plane, that's called a KJ-200. It's actually a derivative of a Soviet Union aircraft from back in a previous century when we had a Soviet Union. So these are old, big, weird, lumbering planes to be involved in something that's this close an encounter. Another thing that's strange about it is that we didn't find out about it until 2 days after it happened. This unsafe encounter and the having to take the evasive action to avoid the mid-air collision reportedly happened on Wednesday. The Pentagon did not make any announcement about it until Friday. The Chinese military has still made no announcement about it at all. But if you are keeping a list of things to worry about and wonder about these days, I think it's fair to say you can go ahead and put this on the list. And I mean, keep it in context. There's a lot going on right now. We just got a new Treasury Secretary tonight. Steve Mnuchin, just sworn in moments ago. Another Goldman Sachs guy. Oh, good. His dad worked for Goldman Sachs, too. The Labor Secretary nominee now looks like he may be crashing and burning. He may not get confirmed at all. We're going to have the latest on that coming up in just a few minutes tonight, including the weird Oprah Winfrey part of it. The big parlor game that the Beltway media is playing now, which the Trump administration appears to be delighted to play along with, is all about the question of whether the president's going to fire his national security advisor, Mike Flynn. Whether or not you enjoy the will he or won't he apprentice style who's going to get fired drama that the White House is hyping here about him, though, on real national security issues, on real stuff, not just talking about stuff, but real stuff out in the world, there is some serious careening going on right now by our government. I mean, whether or not the national security advisor is going to be fired. And the Washington Post just broke some hot new news about that within the last few minutes. We're going to have one of the authors of that piece joining us in just a moment to explain this new development. Whether or not Mike Flynn is going to get fired, he's the National Security Advisor. He heads the National Security Council, and the National Security Council still doesn't have most of its staff. And late on Friday night, we learned that one of the senior directors in the National Security Council, somebody who Mike Flynn had brought on board to the NSC with him, has now had to leave that post, has had to leave the National Security Council altogether because he was denied his request for a security clearance. We don't know why he was denied his request for a security clearance, but he's out. That seems like a big deal. Whether or not that is distracting to the National Security Advisor, whether or not it's distracting to him to have the President of the United States dangling his potential firing for everybody else's entertainment for days now, whether or not you're sort of engaged in the personality side of this, there is also national security stuff going on that does increasingly feel out of control, even wildly out of control. So we had this incident last week with the Chinese plane and the American plane coming within 1,000 feet of each other in the South China Sea. Right? This was last week. This was Wednesday. The last incident before this one between the U.S. military and the Chinese military in that part of the world, you might remember, it was in early December. Do you remember this? Right after our presidential election, Barack Obama was still president. You might remember then President-elect Donald Trump decided to take a phone call from the president of Taiwan. And from China's perspective, that's the diplomatic equivalent of the United States, throwing a drink in their face and then cursing their mother and then leaving the toilet seat up, right? I mean, it was rattling to them and a surprise. And at first, our American shock about that was that we didn't know if our new incoming president actually understood the magnitude of what he had just done by taking this call from the president of Taiwan. We have a sort of deal with China where we don't recognize the government of Taiwan. When he took that call, we didn't know if he understood that. Did he just blunder into this? His initial comments about taking that call were basically, what's the big deal? President of Taiwan, she called me. She had nice things to say to me. Would have been rude for me not to answer. Eventually, they realized that wasn't going to fly. They had to give some indication that the president knew what he was doing. And so a few days later, they rolled out a new explanation. They rolled out a new explanation saying that the incoming president knew exactly what he was doing, and actually what he was doing was just driving a very hard bargain.
I fully understand the one China policy, but I don't know why we have to be bound by a one China policy unless we make a deal with China having to do with other things.
I understand it, but why do we have to be, we'll turn it into a deal, right? That was December 11th. He's not yet president. The incoming president, the president-elect at that time, saying, one China policy, I don't really plan to abide by it unless I get something for it. You can forget the cornerstone of 40 years of relationship between the United States and China. You can forget this one China policy so painstakingly crafted in the 1970s to allow us to have diplomatic relations with China. We're going to throw that out the window. That doesn't apply anymore unless we get something for it. Well, within 5 days of those comments, remember the Chinese Navy stealing a U.S. military underwater drone from an American ship in the South China Sea? Remember that? Leading to another tense, weird standoff where the Chinese reportedly agreed to give the drone back after they kept it for a few days. And then the president-elect said, actually, we don't want it back. We shouldn't take it back. It was very awkward and strange. Nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. I mean, ultimately, Donald Trump was sworn in the following month, January 20th. After he was sworn in, the Chinese president did not call. Despite all the other world leader conversations the new president had, China made no overtures. That, in turn, led to a bit of groveling from our new president. 11 days after the start of the Chinese New Year, the White House sent belated Happy New Year's greetings to the Chinese president and the Chinese people. And then on Friday, he did finally take his call with the Chinese president, and the White House put out a statement about it, this remarkable statement. Quote, "The two leaders discussed numerous topics, and President Trump agreed at the request of President Xi to honor our one China policy." At the request of? That's what you got for the one China policy? I mean, this is what I mean by careening. President Trump throws the one China policy out the window, puts our relationship with China at less than zero. Communications between our two governments come to an end. We start having hard-to-explain, isolated military confrontations between our troops and theirs in far-flung locales. And then just as suddenly, he totally capitulates. I mean, after saying the one China policy no longer stands, if China wants that back, they're going to have to give us something for it. Then ultimately, the one China policy goes back into effect at the request of the Chinese president. So what we get out of that big bargain is nothing. That was the big deal. All right, you want this thing? You're not going to get that thing unless you give us something. And what we want for it is nothing. You can have it. What kind of a negotiation is that? What was that about? Why bother provoking China? Why bother provoking that country in that way at the very outset of your administration if you're then just going to take it back when they ask? It was really strange. I mean, that is where we were heading into this weekend. This bizarre, unfocused, unforced display of American weakness by our president. That was Friday. Then on Saturday, North Korea tested a brand new ballistic missile that they claim is capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. And at the time of that North Korean missile test, the president was having dinner at his Florida club with the Prime Minister of Japan. Japan, of course, is one of the countries most threatened by North Korea's military belligerence and their nuclear capability. So far, heading into his presidency, our new president's take on North Korea has not always inspired confidence.
One of the papers called the other day, and they said, "Would you speak to the leader of North Korea?" I said, "Absolutely. Why not? Why not?" And they come out, "Trump would speak to him." Who the hell cares? I'll speak to anybody. Who knows? There's a 10% or a 20% chance that I can talk him out of those damn nukes, because who the hell wants him to have nukes? And there's a chance. I'm only going to make a good deal for us.
Wait till you see what kind of deal I got with China. When North Korea tested its missile on Saturday night, and the president was at this dinner party with the Japanese prime minister, he apparently decided that he and the Japanese prime minister would just sort of work it out there at dinner on the terrace at Mar-a-Lago in front of all of the other club guests who were attending the dinner as well. They did not leave and go to a secure facility, and they did not take steps to isolate themselves to discuss whatever material they were discussing around this national security matter. We all just got to see it unfold on Facebook while paying club guests documented the American and Japanese reaction to the latest North Korean missile test on their cell phones because they were allowed to see it all happen. They were allowed to post it all on their social media feeds because why not? It happened in front of them. Now, the White House insisted today that nothing classified, nothing about North Korea at all was being discussed at that dinner table in front of all those guests. The White House says even though it may have looked like a lot of people were scrambling around and there was a lot of paperwork and they were reviewing documents, these guys were reading things, there were discussions involving multiple aides and translators. The White House says today, actually, that whole discussion was not about North Korea at all. It was just about, quote, reviewing logistics for the press conference that happened later that evening after the dinner. For the record, here was Donald Trump's complete participation in that press conference. You can see why the logistics must have been really hard to work out, why it needed all those people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. I just want everybody to understand and fully know that the United States of America stands behind Japan, its great ally, 100%. Thank you.
総理大臣、どうもありがとうございました。我々米国は同盟である日本と共にある。これは 100% です。そういうことを皆さんに伝えたいです。
Are you planning to respond in any way?
That's it. You sort of thought there was going to be more there for a second, right? No, that was it. All the scrambling, all of the aides, all of the documents, all of the conferring, all of the translators and everything. Obviously, it was nothing to do with North Korea. It was just to plan that very complex press conference. I just want everybody to know that the United States of America stands behind Japan, our great ally, 100%. That was it, full stop. That's how they left it on Saturday night at the Situation Room. I mean dinner. And now tonight, they careen back into traffic again. Because the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, she put out a formal statement tonight on behalf of the U.S. government, also responding to the North Korean missile launch after those comments from the president on Saturday night. And Nikki Haley's comment tonight basically threatens war over that missile launch. Quote, "We call on members of the Security Council to use every available resource to make it clear to the North Korean regime and its enablers that these launches are unacceptable. It's time to hold North Korea accountable, not with our words, but with our actions." What actions? What actions are you threatening here? Actions against not only North Korea, but its enablers. When people say North Korea's enablers, they mean China. What actions is the U.S. government now threatening against not just North Korea, but China tonight? And does that threat from the UN ambassador have anything at all to do with the president just saying, "We love Japan, good night," on Saturday as his official response to the missile launch, and the same president completely doing a 180 on his most important China policy the day before that with no explanation for the U-turn? Was that near miss between our plane and a Chinese military plane last week an accident, or was that a provocation on purpose? Is there anybody who's running China at the National Security Council? Tonight, we got a new Treasury Secretary. We got a new VA Secretary. Tomorrow, we'll get a former wrestling executive who will be confirmed as yet another cabinet secretary. In California tonight, nearly 200,000 people have been evacuated in the face of very worrying failures at the largest dam in this country. And the National Security Advisor might be getting fired. Washington Post tonight reporting that the acting attorney general, before she was fired, warned the administration that the National Security Advisor might be vulnerable to Russian blackmail. We've got that story next. There's a lot to keep an eye on. There's a lot of balls in the air right now. But on national security, on the potential for military conflict with other countries, this White House is short-circuiting and starting fires all over the place and careening incoherently from one irreconcilable position to another. And in a world where things proceed in a predictable way, if this were a world where you could always see the news coming, right? Where it was, there was no snowstorms destroying your Orion aircraft in Japan. There was no insane autocratic child dictator shooting off ballistic missiles, right? If it was a world where stuff was predictable, we could afford to be another reckless, incoherent, random news generator among the countries of the world. But to have the United States of America be a source of this much chaos and incompetence, that really is new on this earth. And I don't know how we're going to deal with it in terms of our domestic politics. But increasingly, with each passing day, I really don't know how the rest of the world's going to deal with it either.